The morning of February 27, 1942 found Lieutenant Colonel Jan van der Berg of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army standing on the observation deck of Fort Nieuwe Amsterdam, watching the grey waters of the Java Sea through German-made field glasses. The concrete fortress commanded the approaches to Surabaya Harbor, its 240 mm coastal guns trained on the horizon where intelligence reports suggested elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy might appear at any moment. Van der Berg had served 23 years in the Dutch East Indies, from the jungles of Sumatra to the coral atolls of the Moluccas, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the systematic destruction he had witnessed over the past 6 weeks. The Japanese advance through the Indonesian archipelago had moved with machine-like precision that defied every assumption held by the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army General Staff. When the first reports arrived from Tarakan on January 11th, describing coordinated amphibious landings supported by carrier-based aircraft, Van der Berg and his fellow officers had dismissed them as panic from colonial administrators and used to military realities. The Dutch colonial forces had spent decades preparing for conventional warfare against European adversaries, not amphibious assault specialists who could appear from the sea without warning and establish beachheads faster than defensive reinforcements could respond. Standing beside the coastal battery director, Van der Berg studied the deployment of the American, British, Dutch, Australian command forces along the northern approaches to Java. The heavy cruiser HMS Exeter anchored in the main shipping channel, her 8-inch guns elevated toward maximum range. 3 destroyers of the Royal Netherlands Navy patrolled between the outer islands, their crews at general quarters since dawn. The light cruiser De Ruyter flew the flag of Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, the Dutch naval commander whose combined striking force represented the last meaningful naval opposition between the Japanese invasion fleet and the population centers of Java. The fortress radio crackled with reports from reconnaissance aircraft of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Air Force. Flight Lieutenant Piet Hartog, piloting a Glenn Martin bomber from Malang Airfield, transmitted coordinates for what appeared to be a major Japanese naval force approximately 100 kilometers northeast of Surabaya. His voice carried the tension of a pilot who had watched the systematic elimination of Allied airfields across Borneo and Celebes during the previous month. The Japanese 11th Air Fleet had demonstrated tactical innovations that rendered conventional air defense doctrine obsolete, using coordinated strikes by carrier-based and land-based aircraft to overwhelm defensive fighter patrols before establishing air superiority over invasion beaches. Van der Berg lowered his field glasses and examined the tactical situation board maintained by his intelligence staff. Red pins marked confirmed Japanese landings at Tarakan, Balikpapan, Banjarmasin, and Makassar. Each amphibious assault had followed an identical pattern. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft would conduct systematic photographic missions over the target area, identifying defensive positions, supply installations, and command centers. Within 48 hours, carrier aircraft and long-range bombers would execute coordinated strikes against airfields and harbor facilities, achieving local air superiority. Finally, specially trained Japanese naval infantry would conduct night landings at multiple points, often bypassing heavily fortified positions to strike supply lines and communication centers behind the main defensive lines. The speed and coordination of these operations had shattered the defensive strategy developed by Lieutenant General Hein ter Poorten, commander of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. Dutch colonial forces had been positioned to defend major ports and administrative centers, assuming Japanese forces would conduct conventional frontal assaults against fortified positions. Instead, the Imperial Japanese Navy had demonstrated amphibious warfare capabilities that enabled them to bypass strongpoints entirely, landing at undefended beaches and advancing inland to cut supply lines and isolate garrison forces. The result had been a series of tactical disasters that left entire Dutch battalions cut off from reinforcement and supply. Captain Willem Janssen, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Infantry Regiment, approached Van der Berg with the latest communication from divisional headquarters in Bandung. The Japanese 48th Division had been identified landing at multiple points along the northern coast of Java during the pre-dawn hours of February 27th. Photographic reconnaissance from the few remaining aircraft of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Air Force confirmed the presence of at least 40 Japanese transport vessels, escorted by elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy 5th Fleet. The invasion force included specialized landing craft that could beach directly on coral reefs and unload tanks and artillery without requiring established port facilities. Van der Berg studied the invasion reports with the growing realization that Dutch colonial forces faced an enemy whose amphibious warfare doctrine had evolved far beyond anything anticipated by Western military planners. Japanese naval infantry units, known as Special Naval Landing Forces, operated with equipment and training specifically designed for rapid seizure of defended beaches. Their Type 95 light tanks could be landed directly from specialized craft in shallow water, providing immediate armor support for infantry assaults. Japanese artillery units employed 75mm mountain guns that could be disassembled and carried by individual soldiers, enabling rapid deployment of fire support in terrain inaccessible to conventional vehicles. The tactical sophistication of Japanese amphibious operations became apparent as additional reports arrived from Dutch observation posts along the northern coast of Java. Rather than concentrating their landing force at a single point, Japanese commanders had executed simultaneous landings at Kragen, Rembang, and Surabaya, forcing Dutch defensive forces to divide their reserves between multiple threatened sectors. Each landing included specialized engineer units equipped with flamethrowers and demolition charges specifically designed for reducing fortified positions. Japanese commanders demonstrated detailed knowledge of Dutch defensive preparations, suggesting extensive intelligence operations that had preceded the actual invasion. Major Hans de Witt, intelligence officer for the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army 2nd Division, briefed Van der Berg on the tactical characteristics of Japanese special naval landing forces based on reports from Dutch officers who had escaped from Borneo and Celebes. These units operated with a level of individual initiative that contrasted sharply with the rigid command structures typical of European military organizations. Japanese squad leaders were trained to exploit tactical opportunities without waiting for orders from higher command, enabling rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. Their small arms included the Type 99 light machine gun, which could be operated effectively by a two-man crew and provided superior mobility compared to the heavier automatic weapons employed by Dutch colonial forces. The morning briefing at Fort Nieuwe Amsterdam was interrupted by urgent radio transmissions from Dutch coastal observation posts. Lieutenant Kees van Houten, commanding a reinforced platoon of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army at Gresik, reported large numbers of Japanese landing craft approaching the beaches east of Surabaya Harbor. His transmission described specialized vessels unlike anything in Allied intelligence files, capable of traversing coral reefs that conventional landing craft could not navigate. Japanese engineering units had apparently developed shallow draft vessels specifically designed for operations in the coral-strewn waters of the Indonesian archipelago. Van der Berg recognized that the Japanese amphibious assault on Java represented the culmination of tactical innovations that had been developing throughout their advance across Southeast Asia. The Imperial Japanese Navy had demonstrated the ability to coordinate complex multi-point landings while maintaining air superiority over vast ocean areas. Their logistics operations enabled sustained offensive operations at distances that exceeded the range capabilities of Allied air and naval forces based in Australia or India. Japanese commanders had effectively solved the fundamental challenge of amphibious warfare, achieving tactical surprise while landing sufficient forces to overwhelm local defenders before reinforcements could arrive. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as additional reports arrived from Dutch forces positioned along the northern approaches to Surabaya. Sergeant Major Anton Bakker, a 30-year veteran of colonial service, transmitted from his observation bunker near Tuban that Japanese forces were not advancing directly toward the main defensive positions around Surabaya Harbor. Instead, special naval landing forces appeared to be moving inland toward the transportation network that connected the major port facilities with supply depots and ammunition storage areas in the interior of Java. This tactical approach threatened to isolate Dutch garrison forces by cutting their supply lines rather than engaging them in direct combat. Captain Jansen deployed his 3rd Battalion along the coastal highway between Gresik and Surabaya, positioning anti-tank guns and machine gun nests to cover the most likely approaches from the landing beaches. His defensive preparations reflected standard European military doctrine, assuming that Japanese forces would advance along established roads toward obvious military objectives. The reality of Japanese tactical doctrine would prove dramatically different. Special naval landing forces had been trained to operate in terrain that conventional military units would consider impassable, using small boats and portable equipment to penetrate deep into defensive rear areas. The first contact between Dutch colonial forces and Japanese special naval landing forces occurred at approximately 0800 hours near the village of Sadayu, 15 kilometers inland from the main landing beaches. Second Lieutenant Peter van Alphen, commanding a reconnaissance patrol of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, encountered a Japanese unit that had apparently marched through mangrove swamps to reach a position behind the main Dutch defensive line. Van Alphen's radio report described Japanese soldiers equipped with waterproof communications equipment and amphibious vehicles that could operate in flooded terrain where Dutch forces could not follow. Van der Berg realized that the Japanese had achieved tactical surprise not through deception, but through capabilities that exceeded the operational assumptions of Allied military planners. The Imperial Japanese Navy had developed amphibious warfare techniques that enabled rapid deployment of combined arms formations in terrain and weather conditions that would immobilize conventional military units. Japanese engineering capabilities included specialized bridging equipment that could span rivers and canals without requiring heavy construction machinery. Their logistics doctrine emphasized portable supplies and equipment that could be transported by individual soldiers, reducing dependence on vulnerable supply convoys. The systematic nature of Japanese tactical preparation became evident as reports accumulated from Dutch observation posts across northern Java. Flight Lieutenant Hartog, conducting what would prove to be his final reconnaissance mission before the destruction of Malang Airfield, transmitted detailed observations of Japanese engineer units constructing temporary airfields on beach areas that had been secured during the initial landings. These installations would enable land-based aircraft to provide close air support for advancing ground forces, extending the range of Japanese air power beyond the limitations of carrier-based operations. Major DeWitt analyzed the pattern of Japanese operations and concluded that Allied intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Japanese military doctrine. Rather than employing amphibious warfare as a means of transporting conventional ground forces to distant battlefields, the Imperial Japanese Navy had developed integrated air-sea-land operations that treated the ocean as a highway for rapid deployment of specialized forces. Japanese logistics capabilities enabled sustained offensive operations across vast distances, while their tactical doctrine emphasized speed and surprise over the methodical approach favored by European military traditions. The defensive preparations of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army had been based on assumptions about Japanese capabilities that proved catastrophically incorrect. Dutch colonial forces had expected to face conventional infantry assaults supported by limited air power, similar to the military operations they had observed during the early phases of the European War. Instead, Japanese forces demonstrated coordinated employment of carrier aviation, naval gunfire, and specialized amphibious assault troops that could establish secure beachheads faster than defensive reinforcements could respond. The result was a series of tactical disasters that left Dutch forces isolated and cut off from their supply bases. Radio communications from Dutch units along the northern coast of Java painted a picture of systematic tactical defeat that defied every principle of defensive warfare emphasized in Royal Netherlands East Indies Army training manuals. Captain Ernst van Dijk, commanding a reinforced company at Rembang, reported that Japanese forces had landed behind his positions during the pre-dawn hours, severing his communication lines and blocking his withdrawal routes before launching their main assault on the coastal fortifications. His final transmission described Japanese infantry advancing under cover of accurate mortar fire, supported by flamethrower teams that could neutralize bunker positions defended by machine guns. Van der Berg understood that the tactical situation on Java had become untenable within hours of the initial Japanese landings. The speed and coordination of Japanese amphibious operations had negated the defensive advantages that Dutch colonial forces had expected to derive from fortified positions and interior lines of communication. Japanese commanders demonstrated detailed knowledge of Dutch defensive preparations, suggesting intelligence operations that had identified weaknesses in Allied tactical doctrine long before the actual invasion began. The result was a series of coordinated assaults that exploited every gap in Dutch defensive coverage. The morning of February 27th marked the culmination of a strategic campaign that had begun with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor 10 weeks earlier. The Imperial Japanese Navy had demonstrated amphibious warfare capabilities that enabled rapid conquest of the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, despite the presence of Allied naval and air forces that should have been capable of disrupting such operations. Japanese success resulted from tactical innovations that integrated air power, naval operations, and ground forces in ways that exceeded the operational concepts of their Allied opponents. Lieutenant Colonel Berg received his final orders from divisional headquarters in Bandung at 0845 hours on February 27. The Royal Netherlands East Indies Army would attempt to establish a defensive line across central Java, trading space for time while Allied reinforcements were organized in Australia and India. The reality of the tactical situation, however, made such plans unrealistic. Japanese special naval landing forces had already penetrated deep into the Dutch rear areas, threatening the supply lines and communication centers that would be essential for any organized resistance. The speed and coordination of Japanese operations had effectively paralyzed the command structure of Dutch colonial forces. The destruction of Allied naval power in the Java Sea during the afternoon and evening of February 27 eliminated any possibility of disrupting Japanese logistics operations or preventing additional landings along the southern coast of Java. The combined striking force under Rear Admiral Dorman fought bravely against overwhelming odds, but could not compensate for the tactical advantages that Japanese forces had gained through superior amphibious warfare doctrine. The sinking of HMS Exeter, HMS Houston, and HNLMS de Ruyter marked the end of effective Allied naval resistance in Southeast Asian waters. Captain Jansen withdrew his 3rd Battalion from positions along the coastal highway as Japanese forces advanced inland from multiple landing points. His tactical situation illustrated the fundamental problem faced by Dutch colonial forces throughout the campaign. Japanese amphibious capabilities enabled them to bypass fortified positions and establish new beachheads faster than defensive forces could reposition to meet each threat. The result was a constant series of tactical withdrawals that eventually left Dutch forces with no secure positions from which to organize effective resistance. The final radio transmission from Fort Nieuwe Amsterdam occurred at 1730 hours on February 28, when Berg reported that Japanese special naval landing forces had surrounded the fortress and were preparing for a coordinated assault. His message described Japanese tactics that emphasized rapid movement and accurate fire support rather than the massed infantry attacks that Dutch defenders had expected. Japanese commanders demonstrated tactical flexibility that enabled them to exploit weaknesses in Dutch defensive positions without exposing their own forces to unnecessary casualties. Sergeant Major Backer, whose observation bunker near Tubin had provided vital intelligence during the initial stages of the Japanese landing, transmitted his final report as special naval landing forces overran his position. His description of Japanese tactical procedures provided valuable insights into the training and equipment that had enabled such rapid conquest of Allied defensive positions. Japanese infantry operated with individual initiative that allowed rapid adaptation to changing tactical situations, while their communications equipment enabled coordination between widely separated units without relying on vulnerable radio networks. The result was one of the most successful military campaigns in modern history, accomplished with relatively light casualties despite the vast distances involved and the complexity of the tactical challenges. Flight Lieutenant Hartog conducted his final reconnaissance mission from Malang Airfield on the morning of February 28, observing Japanese forces consolidating their positions across northern Java while preparing for additional landings along the southern coast. His aerial photographs documented the rapid deployment of Japanese engineering equipment and the establishment of supply bases that would support continued offensive operations. The systematic nature of Japanese logistics preparation indicated long-term planning that had anticipated the tactical requirements of sustained amphibious warfare across the Indonesian archipelago. Major DeWitt compiled his final intelligence assessment of Japanese amphibious warfare capabilities based on reports from Dutch officers who had observed their operations throughout the campaign. His analysis identified tactical innovations that had enabled Japanese forces to achieve tactical surprise despite operating at extreme range from their main bases in Japan and the Philippines. Japanese logistics doctrine emphasized portable equipment and supplies that could be transported by individual soldiers, reducing dependence on vulnerable supply convoys and enabling sustained operations in terrain that would immobilize conventional military units. The tactical lessons of the Dutch East Indies campaign would influence Allied amphibious warfare doctrine throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Japanese success demonstrated the importance of integrated air-sea-land operations that could establish and maintain local superiority despite the vast distances involved in Pacific theater operations. Allied forces would eventually develop similar capabilities, but the learning process would require years of tactical experimentation and technological development that cost thousands of lives and vast amounts of military equipment. Captain Van Dyke, whose final transmission from Rembang had described the systematic destruction of his company by Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, represented the experience of hundreds of Dutch colonial officers who witnessed the collapse of defensive strategies that had been developed over decades of military planning. The speed and coordination of Japanese amphibious operations had negated every advantage that Allied forces had expected to derive from fortified positions, interior lines of communication, and knowledge of local terrain conditions. Lieutenant Van Alphen, whose reconnaissance patrol had provided the first detailed observations of Japanese tactics in flooded terrain, survived the initial assault and eventually reached Allied lines in Australia. His debriefing reports contributed to the development of Allied amphibious warfare capabilities that would eventually enable successful offensive operations against Japanese-held territory. The tactical innovations demonstrated by Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces during the Dutch East Indies campaign would be studied and adapted by Allied military planners throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The systematic destruction of Dutch colonial forces in the Indonesian archipelago marked the end of European colonial dominance in Southeast Asia and demonstrated the effectiveness of military doctrine that emphasized rapid deployment and coordinated operations across vast ocean areas. Japanese success resulted from tactical preparation that had begun years before the actual outbreak of hostilities, including detailed intelligence collection, specialized equipment development, and training programs that prepared military units for the unique challenges of amphibious warfare in tropical conditions. Berg spent the remainder of the war in Japanese prison camps, where he encountered thousands of Allied soldiers and officers who had witnessed similar tactical disasters throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Their collective experience provided evidence of Japanese military capabilities that exceeded the operational assumptions of Western military establishments. Despite warnings from intelligence officers who had observed Japanese operations in China during the previous decade, the systematic nature of Japanese tactical preparation indicated strategic planning that had anticipated the requirements of sustained offensive operations across the entire Pacific theater. The morning of February 27, 1942, had begun with Dutch colonial forces confident in their ability to defend established positions against conventional amphibious assault. By evening, the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery, despite the courage and determination of individual soldiers and officers who fought against overwhelming odds. Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces had demonstrated amphibious warfare capabilities that rendered traditional defensive doctrine obsolete, achieving tactical objectives with speed and coordination that defied every assumption held by Allied military planners. The destruction of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army during the Java campaign represented one of the most complete tactical defeats in modern military history, accomplished through innovative employment of amphibious warfare doctrine that integrated air power, naval operations, and ground forces in ways that Allied commanders had not anticipated. Japanese success demonstrated the importance of systematic preparation, tactical flexibility, and technological innovation in military operations conducted across vast distances under challenging environmental conditions. Captain Jansen survived the initial assault and conducted a fighting withdrawal across central Java, observing Japanese tactical procedures that emphasized rapid movement and accurate fire support rather than the massed infantry attacks that Dutch defenders had expected. His post-war analysis of Japanese amphibious warfare capabilities contributed to the development of Allied doctrine that would eventually enable successful offensive operations against Japanese-held territory throughout the Pacific theater. The final collapse of Dutch resistance on Java occurred on March 9, 1942, when Lieutenant General Ter Porten surrendered all Royal Netherlands East Indies Army forces to prevent unnecessary civilian casualties. The speed of Japanese victory exceeded even their own expectations, demonstrating amphibious warfare capabilities that had been developed through years of tactical experimentation and technological innovation. Japanese success in the Dutch East Indies campaign established the foundation for their subsequent offensive operations throughout the Pacific theater, until Allied forces developed comparable capabilities and began their own systematic advance toward the Japanese home islands. The tactical lessons learned during the Dutch East Indies campaign influenced military doctrine development throughout the remainder of World War II and into the post-war period. Japanese innovations in amphibious warfare, logistics operations, and air-ground coordination provided blueprints for military capabilities that became essential for successful operations in the Pacific theater. The speed and coordination of Japanese operations during February and March 1942 demonstrated the effectiveness of military doctrine that emphasized rapid deployment, tactical flexibility, and integrated employment of air, naval, and ground forces across vast ocean areas. Lieutenant Colonel Berg would later reflect that the morning of February 27, 1942 marked not just the beginning of Japanese victory in Java, but the demonstration of military capabilities that would reshape amphibious warfare doctrine for generations to come. The systematic destruction of Dutch colonial forces resulted from tactical innovations that had been years in development, implemented by military units whose training and equipment had been specifically designed for the unique challenges of amphibious operations in the Indonesian archipelago. Japanese success established new standards for military effectiveness that Allied forces would eventually match, but only after years of tactical experimentation and technological development that transformed the nature of warfare in the Pacific theater. The legacy of Japanese amphibious warfare innovations during the Dutch East Indies campaign extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation on Java. Military planners throughout the world studied Japanese tactical procedures and attempted to develop comparable capabilities for their own forces. The speed and coordination of Japanese operations provided evidence that traditional defensive strategies were inadequate against amphibious assault forces equipped with specialized training and equipment. The result was a fundamental transformation in military doctrine that emphasized mobility, coordination, and technological innovation rather than the static defensive strategies that had dominated military thinking since World War I. Berg's experience during the Java campaign exemplified the broader challenge faced by Allied forces throughout the early phases of the Pacific War. Traditional military doctrine proved inadequate against Japanese tactical innovations that integrated air power, naval operations, and ground forces in ways that exceeded the operational capabilities of their opponents. Japanese success demonstrated the importance of systematic preparation, technological innovation, and tactical flexibility in military operations conducted under challenging environmental conditions across vast distances. The systematic nature of Japanese tactical preparation during the Dutch East Indies campaign indicated strategic planning that had anticipated the requirements of sustained offensive operations throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Japanese commanders demonstrated detailed knowledge of Allied defensive preparations and tactical doctrine, suggesting intelligence operations that had identified weaknesses in Western military establishments long before the outbreak of hostilities. The result was a series of coordinated amphibious assaults that achieved tactical objectives with speed and efficiency that transformed the strategic balance in the Pacific theater.